So, Martin, last week it was the Conservative Party conference. Did you follow any of the coverage at all?
So, as you know, I personally would rather fire a nail gun into my own face than follow any kind of party politics. So, no. Can you remind me who the Conservatives are? Let's start there, maybe.
Yeah, the Conservatives, they were a big deal. We're all in this together. Long-term economic plan. Get Brexit done. Grant Shapps did something to do with making train announcements less annoying. It was a whole thing.
Yeah, funnily enough, a fun fact about me is that years ago I needed to come up with a password for something that was like a long phrase, and I actually put in long-term economic plan. Listeners can decide what that says about me. It was that point where every MP was saying it in literally every statement, and it was like, this is now so embedded in my brain that I literally can't think of any other combination of four words, and so I guess that's my password now.
There you go, listeners. Go and have a Google round, try and find Martin's accounts in various places and try your luck. Maybe you can get into his bank. Something like that. But Martin, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because the Tories are still pretty important, even though it's easy to forget they exist now with, like you were ranting about a moment ago, Reform are seen as the big right-wing party now. But the Tories, they're still the official opposition, and who knows, maybe in the next 4 years, there's a sort of non-zero chance they might turn things around because, remember, it was almost exactly 4 years ago this week. It was actually October the 6th, 2021, when Tim Shipman famously declared that Boris Johnson now squats like a giant toad across British politics, which has become like this notorious tweet.
I think what's remarkable about it is that absolutely nobody has picked him up on it. Like it's been 4 years, and at no point has anybody on Twitter or Blue Sky gone, "Oh, that's Tim Shipman. I can't believe he said that silly thing. Let's all pick on him." It's just amazing the silence about it.
Well, the funny thing is, by the time he tweeted that at the time, the polls and everything had already turned. But my broader point is, it shows how the narrative can shift and how our assumptions can shift, because clearly that's what Tim Shipman thought at the time. And clearly everyone's assuming now that reform is inevitable. Well, who knows? Maybe the Tories could turn things around. Anyway, the reason I want to talk about this, Martin, is because at Tory party conference this speech, there was a really interesting speech by Claire Coutinho, the Shadow Energy Secretary.
Okay, go on. Why was it interesting? Let's humour this.
Okay, so first of all, and less relevant to abundance, I'm going to mention it anyway, though. Coutinho, she actually appeared to have taken my advice, as weird as it sounds. So before conference season, I wrote an article about how politicians should change up the conference speech format. It's old and tired, and I said they should give Apple-style keynotes like Steve Jobs used to do. And crucially, I think politicians should use a screen behind them and show us graphics and graphs and stuff, and not just stand behind a lectern and talk like politicians have done for the last 100 years. Anyway, I'll put a link to that on abundancepod.com so you can read how prophetic I am. But anyway, so what amazed me was seeing that Coutinho, she actually did this. She actually did a speech. It was about 23 minutes long, and it was still, a politician's speech. There were still digs and jokes and so on, but she peppered in some graphs. She tried to sort of explain things and talk about policy and stuff like that, and I just thought it was a sort of weirdly fascinating approach to take.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing behaviour from a politician at a party conference. I guess now, James, what you're trying to tell us is that you want to take credit for this, as you do for most things that are even tenuously linked to stuff that you've written. You tend to say, I wrote about Sunday trading, and now suddenly it's the talk of the country. It must be because of my Substack that 7,000 people subscribe to. So I assume you think this is because of you as well?
Yeah, I feel like I'm in the Truman Show here and all of Westminster is reacting to my takes. But Martin, so that's not just that I wanted to talk about this for. It's because her speech was actually pretty interesting in the substance. And to my surprise, given that, I am a centre-left lefty type. I used to be more of a firebrand lefty type, but, now I'm 38. But I actually agreed with quite a bit of what she had to say.
Yeah, so when you're not claiming to have invented PowerPoint, James, you are increasingly known for your conservative views. So come on, show us some of these things that you've now adopted as your latest position.
Okay, so leaving aside that characterization, let's start with this clip, where it basically sounds as though Claire Coutinho, again, quite an important politician, she's been abundance pilled.
Today, there is not a single country on earth which is high growth and low energy. That's because energy is not just part of the economy, it is the economy. It feeds into the costs of every business, every journey, every loaf of bread. That's why, right now, the cost of energy is one of the biggest problems that we have. It's a stealth tax that's making us all poorer, and it's killing our industry. The industries of the future need energy too, whether it's advanced manufacturing or AI. Whether it's a factory or a data center or a super lab, they will need cheap, reliable energy. And they'll go where they find it. It would be the first time in generations that we would no longer be at the forefront of a technological revolution and will be poorer because of it. Those businesses will be created, just not here in Britain. We won't have saved the planet. We'll have failed the next generation.
So, as you can tell from those two clips, there's still, lots of party political stuff in there. This is a conference speech after all, but I thought it was really striking because, and maybe this is just how low my expectations are, but like we say, we had a senior cabinet minister, someone who is regularly talked about as a future leader of the Conservative Party. She seems to actually get it. Like, she seems to get the problems of this country. And she specifically talks about, at one point, a persistent problem we've talked about on this podcast, which is air conditioning and how just 5% of homes here have it. And compared to, nearly every home in America, she drew that comparison. And she laments at how the London plan, which we talked about on this show, basically bans air conditioning from being installed in London because London takes this approach of arguing that we should build dual aspect flats so you get the natural wind sort of whistling through the windows, but it's not as good as air conditioning.
Yeah, that does sound quite Dickensian, the way that you've portrayed that with the wind whistling through the windows and the frames rattling. We're massive fans of air conditioning on this show, of course. We talk about it a lot. I feel like we probably talk about it a bit less than we did 2 months ago, and I suspect it might be a few more months before we talk about it much again. But hey, maybe you can claim credit for this as well. Maybe she's one of our valued listeners.
It certainly sounds like she could be a listener, Martin. I guess we'll know for sure if she starts talking about, that road near you with all the potholes in that can't be fixed, and that'll be the tell. But anyway, I'll give you one more clip from the speech, just another bit that I quite liked from the speech.
Increasing the cost of electricity is the worst possible climate policy too. If you want people to use electric cars, here's a revolutionary idea: make electricity cheap. If you want people to use electric heating, make electricity cheap. If you want to build data centers to cut bills, to reduce poverty and drive growth, make electricity cheap.
So I think this is why I sort of agreed with more of what she said than I expected to, because, like I say, she understood a lot of the significant problems and understood a lot of the solutions, I think.
So, I agree. Nice vibes. Where's the policy, James? What's that?
Yeah, so the significant announcement over the last couple of weeks is that the Tories have said that if they somehow make it back to power, that's a big asterisk on that at the moment, but they would scrap the Climate Change Act.
Sounds pretty dramatic, James, and I suspect probably worrying to quite a lot of our listeners, but we do try and keep an open mind on things here, so let's steel man this. What's wrong with the Climate Change Act, do we think?
Yeah, so it's an interesting law. So it was passed in 2008 and it set up sort of most of the architecture for our current approach to achieving net zero. So it gave us the Climate Change Committee, which comes out every so often, and it sets sort of limitations on the amount of carbon that Britain is legally allowed to emit. And Coutinho's view is that basically this has driven a whole bunch of other government decisions, which in her view haven't worked out. So, for example, another thing we spoke about on the show before is the Contracts for Difference renewable energy scheme. So basically, this was a policy that started in the coalition government. The idea was that when you want to build out renewable infrastructure, you have the government say, well, we'll buy a fixed amount of energy at a fixed price. So that if you're investing in like building a wind farm or something, you get a guaranteed return on investment. It makes the wind farm seem like a good idea, where you're not at the mercy of the gas price going all over the place. But the problem is, she reckons, is that it's been a bad deal. So Britain's been paying over the odds, and she has some numbers in the speech, which I'm sure people could argue about. Real experts in this can argue about the exact limitations on where the limits are there. But the fundamental thing is she argues that all of this is pushed onto consumers, basically higher energy prices. And then there's a broader critique as well than just the Climate Change Act, but she really goes after Ed Miliband here, because she also doesn't like the carbon tax that's been imposed. That's imposed at the moment on fossil fuel producers. And she reckons that if we cut this tax, I think it's a 30% tax, 20% tax or something like that, if we got rid of this tax on fossil fuels, it would reduce energy bills for people in their homes by about 20%, or what she says is 165 quid a year for the, quote, average family. And then there's a whole bit of the speech as well, contrasting the claim that Labour at the last election, they kept saying that their net zero policy could cut bills by £300, but I think everyone at this point thinks that was probably a bit optimistic. So there was a sort of big critique in there, I think.
Yeah, so it's a challenging one. So I get that obviously we want energy and energy bills to be cheaper because that's good for the country, it's good for consumers. It's generally the more abundant and cheap electricity is and energy, the better it is for everybody. Obviously, if you removed carbon taxes, that would reduce energy bills by some amount. I'm not sure if I believe that it's 20% because 160 quid a year is really not 20% of most people's energy bills, as far as I'm aware. And I also understand there are concerns about how far and how quickly can you build out renewables. We talked previously about Jeremy Corbyn's love of wind farms and his desire to put umpteen billions of pounds into plastering them all over the North Sea. And it's like, great, it's nice vibes, but also you've got supply chains and, are you actually able to build them cost effectively at that kind of scale that quickly? And of course, if you go beyond a certain balance of renewables, then you start running into questions of how do you move that electricity around the country and how do you make sure that it's backed with a more stable energy source like nuclear. But ultimately, if you're asking why energy bills in the UK are high, it's because of gas. It's because as a country, we are massively dependent on importing gas. And even if we weren't, even if we went and drilled the North Sea for it, it would still cost the same as the import cost unless we subsidized it effectively. So if you're asking why energy bills are so high, it's because of volatility of gas prices. Sure, tax plays a small part, but the main answer is the wholesale gas price. And so you want to get rid of that. And also, climate change is still a thing. So what's your plan for that? And why isn't it nuclear and renewables, which are both clean and abundant and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, which are really, really volatile and expensive?
So this is why I'm a bit more skeptical about some of the things she had to say as well, because I care about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that we're emitting as well. And I'll come back to nuclear in a moment, but there is a section of the speech I wanted to talk about, which she mentioned. She essentially makes the entirely accurate observation of how Britain is only a tiny proportion of carbon emissions. So I guess the argument is, even if we do all of this stuff, even if we have the carbon taxes and have higher bills to sort of facilitate a build out of net zero infrastructure, the argument is it will barely make a dent. And so in a sense, I think this is a bit like the technology argument that was made by the Tony Blair Institute. We spoke about them on one of our earlier shows, and the argument there is that we should really focus on green tech. If we can have British industry and British scientists working out how to make solar panels cheaper and batteries cheaper, then we can invent cheaper tech and then roll it out to the rest of the world, and that will get us to net zero quicker, because ultimately it's all about what India and China do. And Coutinho says similarly, she says, rather than force our people to be early adopters, I want us to be the early creators of the technology that we can export around the world, which again sounds like a really good idea, I think.
Yeah, if I'm honest, it all feels a little bit rhetorical in the sense that it's kind of pandering to the idea that net zero is the reason why your bills went up. And so let's not push this on the British public when it's going to be really expensive. But ultimately, if you're the creator of the technology, you're also going to be the early adopter of it, right? Because what's the biggest lever the government has to encourage these technologies? It's to make sure that they're being built and deployed in the UK and in the rest of the world. And so it sort of feels like a smart person kind of leaning into the fact that reform and that vote are also actually quite pro-technology and pro-British manufacturing and so on. And it's building a more positive case, I guess, to sell to the public than what I would argue if I was being honest about it, which is that I don't actually care what our contribution is in global terms. I think it's kind of like dropping litter. It doesn't matter how much you drop. You have a moral responsibility to not litter in the same way that you have a moral responsibility to not pollute or not leak excessive amounts of carbon into the environment. But I appreciate that is a bit old-fashioned and, dare I say, a bit conservative of me.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think we should be doing all the tech stuff as well. If we had some sort of a better policy for helping our scientists, maybe a looser visa regime to get some scientists over, something like that to try and do that. Fantastic. But yeah, we do ultimately, I think, I think if we want to be credible on climate, especially when persuading the rest of the world to do stuff and persuading India and China to do stuff that matters, we also need to be showing that we're doing our bit as well, even if it isn't impactful in and of itself. So I guess given this, then the challenge for the politicians is working out how to balance this need to demonstrate good behaviour with something that voters won't find repellent, I guess.
Yeah, and especially, to be fair, at a time when everything seems really crap and expensive and people just don't really feel like they've got the bandwidth or the capacity or the patience for dealing with problems that aren't, how am I going to pay my gas bill at the end of the month?
And I think the real tell that there is actual politics at play here, and it's not really just about reducing bills, came a bit later on in the speech. So Coutinho, she had a good bit on nuclear. She strongly supports it, which is great. She showed a graphic, brilliant. She was showing a graphic, something politicians had never thought to do before. It worked really well because it was a map showing, the amount of energy that you could generate.
Map, James.
No.
A map. A politician with a map. Christ almighty. What are we going to have next?
I suppose it was actually more of a diagram. Now I say that. It was basically, she was making the point that the same amount of energy a nuclear power plant could generate is about the equivalent of having a solar farm the size of the Isle of Wight. There was a big picture of the Isle of Wight, and it really made the point really starkly. But this was all in service of making a point clearly for the people in the room who aren't necessarily on board with net zero and doing stuff like climate change, because she says, on a small island like ours, when every inch of countryside is precious, that matters. So instead of carpeting the countryside and wind and solar farms, we will make it easier and cheaper to build dense, reliable, secure, clean nuclear energy. And I'm just thinking, like, well, can't we have both? Why can't we just make it easier to build nuclear and solar panels and wind turbines?
Well, also, it sounds like she's found the perfect solution, which is, we're a small island. There's an even smaller island just underneath us, and we can carpet that in solar panels. The Isle of Wight. Finally, somebody has found a use for the Isle of Wight, other than for, people who live in Chichester to go on day trips in yachts there. Amazing. It's a win-win.
So I think we've solved it, Martin. So essentially, I just wanted to flag this up because, and again, maybe I've just set the bar really low here, but I thought it was really striking and sort of warm and old-fashioned to see a politician actually engaging with sort of policy substance on this sort of level. I mean, agree or disagree with her, it was like a reasonable political debate. I agree with some of the things she said. I disagree with some of the other things she said. And that was just nice to see, given the state of everything else in politics at the moment.
Yeah, and I think it's testament to the fact that not everything has to be dumbed down into sound bites. I think you can actually give audiences a little bit of credit and talk to them like sensible adults. And I guess even more importantly, James, this is the next step on your journey to becoming a Tory, which you clearly are going to be by the time you're, 45?
I can't play golf, Martin. I don't think I'll ever be a Tory. But I also want to flag this because, I am a bit of an apologist for the current regime. I'm a little bit of a Starmerite. So this shows I can take the other side seriously. And let's be honest, the Tories could be in power. So what they say does matter. Obviously, it doesn't look like
and
at the moment.
I could have a film career, James.
And don't get me wrong, there was still, in this speech, there was still lots of normal, political Punch and Judy. But given the rest of the Conservative Party seems to be going to this weird, dark place at the moment, with other politicians in the party talking about white British people a lot, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, or scary, ominous stuff. Like I say, it was sort of refreshing to see just a normal policy debate taking place and taking ideas seriously and painting a sort of more optimistic vision of an energy abundant future, which is nice and good to see.
Which is good, because if you're a rational voter in the UK, you should want there to be a non-crazy centre-right party holding Labour to account and not just kind of cede that ground to Nigel Farage and Reform. So it's nice to see the green shoots of recovery perhaps starting to appear, but I guess we'll see what the next few years, and particularly the next few months, when I'm sure we'll have another Conservative leader, brings. Now, maybe, like James, this has inspired some of our listeners to think about joining the Conservative Party in the near future. But if you're not quite ready to make that full transition yet, maybe you're just a little bit Tory curious, as we like to call it, there's a centrist organisation that you can sign up to, a kind of gateway drug, if you like, and that's this podcast, James. What should we ask our readers, our listeners, sorry, they're not reading unless something's gone very wrong. What should we ask them to do?
Martin, I'm not entirely sure I'm on board with this characterization, but nevertheless, anyone who's enjoying this content, make sure you're subscribed. Go to your podcast app, tell your friends, go on to WhatsApp now, send them a link to the pod and say, hey, you'll probably like this. It's like nerdy policy and politics chat. You're into that. So yeah, go and do that and give us 5 stars as well. Feed our egos.